They woke to the distant thunder of treads, a low, insistent rumble that rolled down the valley like weather. Men who had known the sound of armor their whole adult lives told themselves it was real. The cadence of chain links, the hollow thump of overlapping track plates, the metallic whisper of gears. Orders moved along the line. Positions were shifted. Command posts lit lamps and marked coordinates. At dawn, the sky cleared, and the ridge opposite was empty. The sound had been a lie. This was not improvisation in a foxhole. It was the planned work of an Allied unit that treated sound as a weapon. Known in official files as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and remembered by historians and veterans simply as the Ghost Army, that group stitched together artists, advertising men, engineers, sculptors, stage designers, and sound technicians into a single mission: to mislead, distract, and delay enemy decision-making through illusion. Their props included inflatable tanks and painted plywood convoys, but the trick that haunted commanders' maps and sobered frontline troops was often purely auditory, recorded, amplified, and placed so convincingly that entire enemy movements were judged on what their ears had told them. Imagine for a moment what it takes to make a battlefield hear things that are not there. The human ear is an engine of prediction. It listens, fills in gaps, and nudges the eye and the mind toward a conclusion. A rumble in the night invites a look toward the valley and a rearrangement of forces. Sound is immediate, cheap, and intimate. It arrives directly in the skull and is hard to argue with at 3 in the morning. The Ghost Army exploited that intimacy, turning field recordings into tactical prompts and loudspeaker arrays into actors on a soundstage the size of a county. How did painters and designers end up tricking hardened officers with fake footsteps and projected tank sounds? To answer that is to follow a path from drafty studios and radio labs into the mud of forward positions, to meet the technicians who learned to listen to machinery as if it were music, and to see how technical ingenuity married wartime urgency. It is also to wrestle with an uncomfortable truth. The same skills that allowed men to save lives by diverting hostile fire could also cloud judgment, mislead civilians, and complicate the moral ledger of war. If you appreciate deep historical dives into how unconventional tactics shaped key moments in modern conflict, subscribe. This channel goes into these techniques with evidence and care. The Ghost Army emerged in a moment when deception was not an eccentric hobby, but a strategic lever. Allied planners had learned through experience that battles were won as much by the enemy's perceptions as by the dispositions on their own maps. A convincing illusion could immobilize a formation, draw units away from a threatened sector, or create the impression of overwhelming force where only a handful stood. That value proposition brought together people who would rarely meet in peacetime. Broadway set designers found themselves inflating tanks in the rain. Sculptors painted camouflage for decoy artillery. And soundmen, some with radio studio and advertising backgrounds, took on the job of manufacturing the audible presence of armies. Those sound technicians were not technicians in the narrow, complacent sense. They were field recordists and mechanical tinkerers, the kind who knew how to coax a believable noise from an unlikely object. Before the war, some had worked in radio. Others had been composers or sound designers for theater and film. The unit recruited them precisely because they saw sound as material, a texture that could be shaped, layered, and timed. The work demanded imagination and improvisation. When archival sources and veteran recollections describe their methods, they speak in the language of craft rather than formula. Gather the elements, isolate the signature tones, create the rhythm, and let perspective and playback do the rest. The first step in that chain was the recording. There were methods that were practical and often surprisingly low-tech. A sound man would place a microphone near the sprocket and idler of a tank track to capture the metallic staccato of movement. For footsteps, they would string boards and plates across a span and stamp a pair of soldiers' boots in different patterns to summon the cadence of a column. Shell casings hitting metal, the creak of a turret turn, the staccato of a distant machine gun. Each element was archived like a palette color. Sometimes, when the real thing was unavailable, they recreated the sound in makeshift studios. A platoon's march might be simulated by dragging a heavy chain across a wooden floor at a tempo that matched a soldier's stride. The point was not scientific purity, it was psychological plausibility. Layering was the next crucial move. A single recorded element, stripped bare, sounds clinical, like a sample in a lab. The technicians built scenes by stacking sounds. Under the low-frequency churn of treads, they would place metallic clanks that hinted at a vehicle's interior mechanics. Above that, intermittent cadence noises suggested troop movement. Tucked into the center was the occasional creak or sigh for realism. The resulting composite created an aural profile, a complex, evolving texture that suggested size, speed, and distance. Listeners did not parse individual elements, they grasped a gestalt, a whole that indicated a battalion rather than a solitary vehicle. But recording and layering alone do not create deception. Sound is spatial. It behaves differently across terrain, reacts to weather, and reaches two ears with subtle delays that establish direction. The Ghost Army's innovation was not merely in making sounds, but in placing them. Playback rigs, often mounted in trucks for mobility, used arrays of loudspeakers that could be set along a ridge, staggered to create delay in movement, or elevated to simulate approach from a distant road. By adjusting gain on different speakers and introducing slight timing offsets, technicians could create the illusion of approach or receding movement. A set of speakers that brightened in sequence suggested a column moving through a valley. A crescendo across a spread of arrays implied a mass gathering beyond the next hill. One helpful way to think about this is to imagine painting with noise. Where a painter applies brushes of color to create depth, the sound designer applied layers of recorded texture across a landscape, using volume and timing to sculpt distance. A low, broad wash of bass might indicate a mass of heavy armor far away. Sharper mid-range bursts delivered serial cues that suggested individual vehicles or dismounted troops. The technicians used the physical environment, the slope of a valley, the angle of trees, the reflective quality of a barn wall, as a canvas. Echoes were not a nuisance, they were material to be used. A distant echo could double as a separate element in the soundscape, convincing listeners that the source extended beyond the first audible ridge. Mobility was essential. A successful deception required the sound to be in the right place at the right time, and the right place was often not the safest. The trucks that housed playback systems were made to be rugged and fast enough to get within range and then move on. They needed to conceal their own presence while broadcasting convincingly. In certain setups, a string of small amplifiers and loudspeakers was moved forward overnight to occupy positions that matched a false convoy's supposed route. In others, a single powerful speaker was mounted high and pointed to carry low-frequency components over distance. The arrangement always had to account for wind, terrain, and the likelihood of enemy reconnaissance. A playback that did not gel with what aerial photographs or scouts reported would be dismissed. Sound was rarely the sole evidence, but it could be the decisive tiebreaker in a commander's mind. Coordination with visual deception magnified the effect. Inflatable tanks and rubber trucks were not merely novelty. When combined with sound, they formed a multi-sensory argument. Aerial reconnaissance might spot a cluster of tarpaulin shapes. Radio operators might intercept false chatter. Sound trucks would then lay down the oral confirmation. The result was cumulative. When multiple channels told the same story, the enemy's tendency to trust converging sensory cues worked against them. In battlefield psychology, confirmation through multiple senses reduces doubt. The Ghost Army exploited that cognitive shortcut. A painted decoy looked suspicious from certain angles, but heard from a mile away and accompanied by the right radio traffic, it read as real. The technicians knew that sensation stacked. Sound bolstered vision, and vision validated sound. But the unit's methods were not a fixed recipe. They adapted to the conditions at hand. Where tree cover diffused sound, technicians used closer speaker placement to preserve directionality. Where open valley floors allowed noise to travel, they softened the high frequencies to prevent harshness that would betray mechanical fakery. The work was iterative. Teams would run a sequence at night, then adjust speaker positioning and timing in response to observed illusions. Those adjustments required a sensitivity to acoustics that bordered on artistry. A microphone in hand was not merely an instrument. It was a probe into how the landscape would remold the sound once released. That artistic sensibility extended to the people who carried out the work. Veterans' accounts and post-war studies portray technicians who treated recordings like score sheets. One sound man recalled feeling akin to a conductor, cueing elements so that the oral narrative reached its intended climax at the precise moment enemy scouts would be listening. Another remembered the absurdity of rehearsing the scrape of metal tracks in a studio while rain pelted the windows, wondering whether the realism of the samples would hold up on a cold, wind-scoured morning in France. These were not faceless engineers. They were improvisers who learned to inhabit both the technical and performative sides of deception. Command structures tolerated and even encouraged that improvisation because the payoff could be operationally significant. A diversionary sound that persuaded an opposing commander to shift reserves could buy hours for a real maneuver elsewhere. But here the record must be cautious. Claims that the Ghost Army fooled entire divisions circulate, often unqualified. The archives and veteran recollections confirm repeated success in shaping enemy perceptions, and some of those accounts are documented in secondary sources. For example, the documentary and book known as The Ghost Army, that drew on unit records and interviews. However, precise, universally verifiable claims about the scale of these deceptions, how many divisions repositioned, how many hours were gained, are often undefined or reported with qualifications by historians. The tactic's value was tactical and often situational, not universal. Sometimes the sound convinced, sometimes environmental cues or opposing intelligence undercut the illusion. Ethics threaded through every decision. The unit's leaders were pragmatic. Deception was a legitimate instrument of war. Yet technicians were not moral vacuums. They understood that their work had consequences, that a successful misdirection could save lives on one front while exposing others, and that civilians might be terrorized by noises that carried false promises of military presence. The moral ledger was complicated and personal. Some technicians later described mixed feelings about their craft. They took pride in cunning and creativity, but those emotions sat beside the memory of men who had been repositioned, men who had been killed or wounded because their commanders responded to a sound that was engineered rather than elemental. Operational constraints kept the methods honest. Sound could be persuasive, but it had limits. Weather reduced predictability. Wind could bend directionality, and rain could damp low-frequency transmission. Terrain could betray a trick. Open ground might reveal the flatness of a recorded rumble, while dense forest could turn a convincing playback into a muddled whisper. Enemy intelligence was adaptive. If aerial photography contradicted acoustic evidence, skeptics prevailed. The technicians therefore often used sound not in isolation, but as the capstone on a constructed narrative. Radio chatter simulating command activity, decoy vehicles positioned to receive aerial recognition, and a timed playback to confirm the story. The unit's creative culture also meant a rare operational flexibility. Unlike standard military formations bound by doctrine, these teams were expected to improvise. They were given objectives rather than rigid prescriptions. Make the enemy believe an armored corps was gathering in a given sector. Lure reinforcements away from a targeted breakthrough. Convince reconnaissance that a division had departed, allowing a real unit to slip into place. Within those broad aims, teams were free to experiment. That latitude came with risk. A failed deception could alert an adversary to the presence of a decoy network, and misuse could erode trust in genuine alerts. In the fog of war, credibility mattered. Once a commander grew wary of audio cues, the instrument's power diminished. Technically, the unit navigated a balance between fidelity and abstraction. High-fidelity studio-grade recordings had a paradoxical danger. They sounded too pristine. A perfectly clean tank rumble, when heard through the wind and trees, could flag a perceptive listener that something was off. Conversely, a slightly degraded organic-sounding composite with small irregularities and imperfections often read as more authentic. The goal was not acoustic accuracy in the narrow sense, but ecological plausibility. The sound had to belong to the environment in which it was played, and sometimes that meant adding the right little noises. A clank here, a bark of a distant animal there, the intermittent groan of a nearby structure. The most convincing deceptions were those that respected the messy realism of lived soundscapes. There were also technical trade-offs tied to power and concealment. Amplifiers in trucks needed fuel and batteries. Long, low-frequency transmission required robust drivers and careful speaker placement to avoid betraying the rig's location. Portable speakers offered mobility but limited range. The technicians, therefore, designed hybrids, arrays that could be augmented or condensed as missions demanded. In some setups, a curtain of small speakers extended across a ridge to create a spreading soundstage. In others, a single heavy bass speaker projected long wavelength energy that conveyed the sense of mass. Engineers experimented with directional baffles and folded horn enclosures to shape dispersion patterns, always mindful that a field-deployed loudspeaker was a blunt instrument pretending to be subtle. One metaphor the technicians used, and which remains useful for modern listeners, is that of a stereo painting in the open air. In a studio, stereo can position a violin to the left and a trumpet to the right. In the field, the team wanted to position an armored column to the north and an infantry march to the south, using the landscape itself as the canvas. Delay, volume, and spectral balance were the paint, and the terrain decided how the brushstrokes held. The craft required both ear and empirical testing. Technicians would walk listening routes, play back test patterns, and recalibrate in situ. The improvisational streak in their work was not reckless. It was experimental, controlled, and always informed by rapid field feedback. This technical ingenuity had to translate into tactical choreography. Timing was everything. A playback that began too early or too late could be disastrous. Too early, and scouts would find the staging area empty before any enemy moved. Too late, and the enemy might pass through the decoy unharmed. The sound needed to match not only location, but expected behavior. If a commander expected a convoy to be arriving along a road at first light, then the aural pattern had to include approaches, pauses, and acceleration that matched road movement. An armored column that suddenly sounded stationary, engines idling, invited a different response than one that battered forward. Thus, the Ghost Army's operators were part acoustician, part dramaturge, and part intelligence analyst, crafting sequences that responded to the rhythms of military action. And yet, the Ghost Army's ambition was tempered by reality. Even the best-designed playback systems could not substitute for human observation and corroboration. Enemy commanders who had scouts or reliable aerial reconnaissance remained harder to fool. The unit's success often depended on cultivating uncertainty, not absolute deception. If an opposing headquarters harbored doubt about where forces truly were, the scale of that doubt could be exploited. A well-placed rumble might not move mountains, but it could nudge a skeptical commander toward caution, and that caution could be worth lives. As this technical portrait grows, the emotional landscape of those involved becomes harder to ignore. The sound men spoke later of nights when they listened to their own recordings and felt a complicated pride. They had learned to produce things of eerie realism, footsteps that convinced sentries and tank roars that sent whole companies scrambling. Yet they also remembered the human faces of the consequences, the enemy officers who later realized they had been outmaneuvered, the soldiers who were shifted into harm's way because they trusted a fiction, the civilians who were startled awake and terrified by the phantom of approaching armor. The work was creative, but always underlaid with a sober awareness that their art intersected with lives in the most consequential of ways. This intersection produced not only tactical improvisation, but also post-war reflection. When historians began to assemble the unit's story decades later, drawing on official records, veteran interviews, and surviving photographs, one theme recurred. The Ghost Army's use of sound was as much about shaping decisions as it was about producing sensory illusions. The unit's success stemmed not merely from making convincing noises, but from understanding how those noises would be interpreted by men under stress. In that sense, the project was psychological as much as it was technological. At the same time, caution is necessary in the narrative. Popular retellings sometimes lean toward spectacle. Dramatic anecdotes of entire divisions misled by a speaker truck make for compelling copy, but they risk flattening the complex relationship between perception and action. The evidence, when carefully examined, points to a pattern of tactical utility rather than a single decisive gambit. The Ghost Army's sonic operations created opportunities and shaped probabilities. They rarely, if ever, decided campaigns on their own. To treat them as magical keys that open strategic doors is to misread the historical record. One fact stands firm: the techniques developed by these technicians left a legacy. The intersection of audio engineering and psychological insight foreshadowed later uses of sound in operations beyond the line of battle, from broadcast propaganda to modern information operations that exploit sensory and cognitive biases. The Ghost Army's work was an early instance of weaponizing perception, a demonstration that infrastructure for sound and the strategies for deploying it can be as consequential as the hardware of tanks and planes. Before we move to specific battlefield episodes where these techniques were employed, the moments when theory met chaos and the human responses determined outcomes, it is worth pausing on the limits that this kind of deception imposed, both ethically and operationally. The ethics are never simple. On one hand, a deception that redirects hostility away from populated areas or buys time for evacuations can be profoundly humane. On the other, deceiving commanders, friend and foe alike, can result in misapplied force, unnecessary exposure, and collateral harm. The technicians who recorded the footsteps and engineered the playback were, in practical terms, creating choices for others. They did not control how those choices would be exercised. Operationally, the technique demanded resources and expertise that were not always available. High-quality playback required equipment that could break down. Creative technicians needed time to make realistic composites, and the coordination necessary to align visual, radio, and acoustic deception required clear intelligence about what the enemy expected. Without that intelligence, a fabricated soundscape was a shot in the dark. In many operations, the Ghost Army's efforts were part of a mosaic of deception activities, each element supporting the others, which is the appropriate lens through which to examine their contribution. Now, having traced the origin, the people, and the technical anatomy of the Ghost Army's sound deception, we stand at the threshold of the moment when these tools were put into practice. The next step is to follow one of those deployments into the field, to see how a composite soundscape was arranged under pressure, how timing and terrain conspired to help or hinder the illusion, and how enemy commanders responded when their senses and their maps told incompatible stories. That is where artistry met battlefield urgency and where the moral complexity of using sound as a weapon became most acute. Sources and detailed accounts of these operations appear in post-war documentation and in compilations of veteran testimony. See, for example, the Ghost Army documentary and companion book for archival interviews and unit records. For a closer look at a particular operation or a composite scenario drawn from multiple documented missions, consult the materials listed in the description and our related episode on the visual deceptions that accompany these sonic efforts. They moved under cover of night with the careful clumsiness of people carrying props that must not sound like props. Trucks creaked over country lanes while men with microphones and reel-to-reel machines climbed out into moonlit hedgerows. Inflatable tanks, rounded, improbable, like giant theater puppets, were unrolled, painted, and propped on frames. Radio operators keyed faux chatter into the ether. And tucked between a hedgerow and a farm wall, a small team set up a line of speakers, their faces lit by the glow of instrument dials as they listened through headphones and argued in low voices about delay timings and frequency balance. What followed that night is best read as a mosaic assembled from several documented missions rather than a single dramatized episode. Veterans' interviews and unit papers collected in post-war accounts, see the Ghost Army documentary and Rick Byers' work compiling unit records and testimony, describe deployments that shared the same choreography, a composite of sound, sight, and sign deployed to shape an enemy's choices. For clarity, imagine a composite operation drawn from those sources, an operation that captures the unit's method and its immediate effect without pretending to be a single, incontrovertible record. In the composite scenario, an Allied commander needed to mask the movement of a real armored column crossing a river upstream of an expected German observation point. The aim was narrow and tactical: delay enemy reserves, draw attention away from the actual crossing zone, and convince opposing intelligence that a major force had gathered elsewhere. Intelligence suggested that enemy aerial reconnaissance, signals intercepts, and occasional scouting parties were the likely ways the ruse would be assessed. The deception plan, therefore, joined visual decoys, clusters of inflatable vehicles and dummy supply dumps, with false radio traffic and a carefully scheduled acoustic broadcast. The sound team's brief was precise in its intent, if not in its phrasing. Make the far ridge sound alive with tanks and troops at first light, so that when scouting aircraft, intercepted signals, and sporadic observers returned their reports, the chorus of sensory cues would corroborate a massing that did not exist. The technicians worked from field recordings collected over months: the idling cough of diesel engines, the staggered click of steel tracks, the dull punch of a tank turret traverse. They layered these into a sequence that mimicked the approach of an armored column: distant, then nearer, individual vehicle sounds emerging and melting into an overarching bass that suggested weight and scale. At low volume, the track read as a rumor. The slow increase in volume and the staggered emphasis across different speakers made it an approaching reality. Placement of speakers was tactical. The team arranged arrays across a spur of high ground, placing smaller amplifiers along a sweep so that sound would bleed from one point to the next in time-lagged bursts. Where terrain permitted, they used reflective surfaces, old stone barns, rock outcrops, to add natural reverberation, deliberately folding echoes into the playback to imply depth beyond the ridge. The playback truck itself lay concealed in a copse, its own hum muffled by bales and canvas. Operators wore mufflers and moved in double teams so that the rig's presence would not be betrayed by a single careless sound. At 03:30, as a faint pre-dawn gray edged the horizon, microphones captured the first bird song. Then, as rehearsed, the speakers pushed out the lower frequencies. For a commander asleep in a forward observation post, or for a sentry scanning with binoculars, the effect was immediate. Radios that had been monitoring the Vector picked up mock command chatter suggesting a corps-level assembly. A pilot on a recon sortie later reported what looked like a cluster of shapes consistent with armored units. The cumulative nature of the evidence mattered more than the perfection of any single cue. In the morning's confusion, divisional staffers, who had been balancing thin intelligence feeds and standing orders, chose to hold reserves in place and to direct local reconnaissance toward the false concentration. Those decisions, in the composite account modeled on recorded missions, bought hours for the real crossing to proceed under reduced risk. What the composite obscures in favor of clarity is the messiness that almost always accompanied these operations. In at least one documented instance referenced by unit records and interviews, see unit compilation cited in the Ghost Army documentary, a playback's timing ran afoul of unexpected weather. A brisk crosswind bent the low frequencies away from the observation point and carried the mid-range tones straight into a farmyard where a curious farmer, awakened by a sound that seemed too clean, peered out and reported nothing but ordinary cows. In another episode, an overzealous recon pilot flew low and counted diesel-stained tarpaulins on the ground, decoys that, when inspected, revealed seams and painted canvas. The enemy's intelligence could be wrong, and sometimes it was. Equally, sometimes acoustic deception was undermined by a single contradictory report that was weighted more heavily than the ensemble of signals the Ghost Army had taken pains to assemble. These operational vicissitudes point to an essential quality of the Ghost Army's work. It was probability shaping rather than absolute misdirection. The technicians were not trying to force a single reenactment of reality, but to make a particular reading of reality more likely than the alternatives. Sound, especially when married to other deceptive measures, functioned as a nudge. It increased uncertainty, suggested risk where none existed, and encouraged cautious choices. A commander uncertain about whether an apparent concentration was real might, by temperament or doctrine, avoid committing forces. That hesitation could be enough to tilt a local operation. Why did this nudge so often work? Part of the answer lies in how humans treat sound in the wild. Hearing evolved to be anticipatory. A rustle becomes aligned with the threat of an ambush long before sight confirms it. In military settings, that anticipatory instinct is sharpened. Officers and sentries have trained themselves to trust certain acoustic signatures. When those signatures arrive with the cadence and irregularities the Ghost Army could produce, they fit into pre-existing schemas. A tank sound equals armor equals thread. Sound also plays a special role in shared belief. If radio chatter reports an armored mass and a pilot confirms mini tank scene and simultaneously the air carries a convincing bass rumble, the convergence multiplies credibility. This is social proof at scale. Sensory inputs corroborate each other across channels and observers, producing a consensus that is difficult to dislodge. Cognitive factors compound the problem. Under stress, decision-makers rely more heavily on heuristics, mental shortcuts that conserve attention. Confirmation bias nudges people to favor evidence that fits their hypothesis. If interceptor reports have suggested enemy mobility in the region, a well-crafted playback becomes confirmatory. Noise, literal and figurative, competes for attention. The human mind wants to reduce uncertainty quickly. In the face of rising steam and clanking metal, choosing to assume presence rather than absence can feel like the safer option. That conservative bias can be exploited deliberately by deception planners. Yet human systems are not inevitable victims of their senses. Skilled intelligence staffs cross-check multiple sources. Aerial photographs, signal intercepts, and human intelligence can, and sometimes did, expose the deception. In documented missions, the Ghost Army rarely relied on sound as a singular input. Instead, the unit saw audio as the fulcrum that tilted a larger pattern of evidence. Its value lay in complementing radio falsehoods and visual decoys, not in supplanting them. The technicians understood this. Their brief was never merely to make noise, but to make a convincing story audible. After-action reports and veteran recollections contain quieter, more complicated claims about effectiveness. Some accounts stated that deployments had halted enemy advances, that reserves had been misdirected, or that tactical opportunities had been extended by hours. These claims were often phrased with caution: reported to have, veterans recalled, or unit logs indicate, because archival confirmation was sometimes incomplete. The historical record supports tactical successes documented in unit histories and interviews, but it resists narratives of single-handed decisive exploitation. The Ghost Army's work was a contributing cause, frequently valuable in context, seldom an isolated cause of victory. There is a moral ledger to be balanced in that assessment. Tactically, deception could save lives by diverting fire away from a threatened crossing or by buying time for retreat and evacuation. Ethically, those same methods could redirect force in ways that harmed civilians or unbalanced local defensive schemes. Technicians and commanders understood this tension. In veteran interviews, some expressed pride that their work had reduced casualties in specific instances. Others admitted lingering unease that their art, exercised as wartime expediency, had been used to produce death or suffering they had never intended. The strategic calculus of deception is therefore inseparable from questions of accountability and proportionality. Those who designed illusions did not act in a moral vacuum. Their choices shaped other people's choices, sometimes with irreversible consequences. The Ghost Army's methods also left a technical and doctrinal inheritance. Sound as a tool of influence did not end with the war. Post-war, military and intelligence communities continued to study how perception could be shaped across multiple sensory channels. Broadcast propaganda evolved into more complex operations that exploited timing, repetition, and emotional resonance, principles that the Ghost Army had applied acoustically on a small scale. The modern information environment, with its capacity to synthesize voices and images, amplifies those same dynamics. Where the Ghost Army used speakers and canvas decoys, contemporary actors can deploy manufactured audio and imagery at network speed to create plausibility at scale. The ethical questions that accompanied a speaker truck in a French valley now apply to manipulated audio clipped into social feeds. Who bears responsibility when a convincingly faked sound shifts public or military sentiment? Post-war secrecy complicated early analysis of the unit's impact. Because many of the Ghost Army's files remained classified or dispersed in military archives for decades, public awareness of their sonic work came slowly. It was only when veterans and historians began publishing interviews and compiled records, material later used in documentaries and books, that the broader story gained traction. The lag between action and public understanding shaped the unit's legacy. By the time the tale was widely told, cultural attention had shifted toward new media forms. But the lessons about perception control remained salient. Modern military doctrine acknowledges the role of deception in operations, but it also pairs that acknowledgement with rules of engagement and ethical constraints that reflect an awareness of collateral consequences. There is also an institutional lesson. The Ghost Army's effectiveness derived in part from its non-standard composition. Artists, sound designers, theater set constructors, and advertising men who brought techniques from show business to the battlefield. That interdisciplinary makeup was an operational asset. The people who knew how to make an audience believe a scene on Broadway were well suited to making an enemy believe a different, darker spectacle. That lesson echoes in contemporary practice. Effective influence operations often require skills that extend beyond narrow technical proficiency, encompassing narrative craft, audience insight, and cultural nuance. But such capabilities also demand ethical guardrails to prevent misuse. Practical limits and unintended consequences were part of every mission's calculus. Operational failures sometimes exposed the deception network. Air crews who noted suspicious seams in decoy formations, or civilians who reported nothing where suspicion had been raised. Deception, when detected, could harden enemy resolve and provoke retaliatory reconnaissance. There were strategic costs to a tarnished reputation. Once a commander suspected that sensory reports might be manufactured, the value of sound and visual trickery in that theater diminished. For others, it was a reminder of wartime moral ambiguity. A crafted illusion had funneled human decisions, and those decisions had consequences that could not be undone. Historians, in analyzing these episodes, have taken a measured view. The Ghost Army's audio operations stand as a demonstration of tactical creativity and as a cautionary tale about manipulating perception. Their work advanced the technical boundaries of field acoustics and multisensory deception, and their legacy rippled into later psychological operations and influence campaigns. Yet the historical verdict resists romanticization. Sound did not win wars by itself. It altered probabilities, bought time, and sometimes saved lives. But it did so at the cost of ethical complexity and operational risk. The final echo of the Ghost Army's work is an invitation to reflect on how easily perception can be shaped. In a world where voices can be synthesized, images faked, and narratives amplified with unprecedented speed, the tactical mechanics that once resided in trucks parked in silent hedgerows have migrated into platforms and networks. The tools have changed, the theater has expanded, but the human vulnerabilities remain. We are still creatures who trust converging cues. We are still prone to heuristics under stress. And we still form collective judgments that can be nudged by plausible-seeming inputs. Walking away from the ridge in that cold dawn, the men who had cued the speakers carried with them a small private disquiet. They had committed an art to war and watched as it bent other lives to its will. Some wrote home about technical triumphs. Others kept their accounts terse, haunted by the faces of those displaced by their illusions. The public would not fully learn the unit's story for decades when veterans and historians pieced together fragments from archives and memory. The delay in disclosure perhaps preserved an immediate wartime utility, but it also deferred the wider ethical conversation that ought to accompany any technology capable of shaping belief. For the modern listener, the Ghost Army story offers both a technical curiosity and a moral mirror. It asks us to consider how we verify what we hear, how we weigh sensory convergence, and how we assign responsibility when manufactured perceptions produce real-world outcomes. The ghostly footsteps and fake tank roars that once moved commanders to action are not simply historical oddities. They are ancestral to contemporary dilemmas about authenticity and influence. If you want to explore the archival records, veteran testimonies, and photographic evidence that informed this account, the sources listed in the description offer direct access to unit records and the documentary work that helped bring the Ghost Army story to light. For a companion look at the visual side of these deceptions, the inflatable tanks, painted decoys, and aerial tricks, watch our related episode examining how appearance and sound were woven together to shape wartime belief. In the end, the valley remained empty, and yet for a night it had been full of purposefully made sound. That sound changed plans, nudged decisions, and left behind a residue of ethical questions we continue to answer in new contexts. The lesson lives in the echo. Perception can be engineered, and when it is, the engineer must answer for what follows.